Alright. Welcome back. I'm just setting some stuff up. And should be good to go, I think. Okay. So last time, actually, I read 2 chapters, but I had Twitch on in the background, and so it sounded like I was summoning a demon. And I'm trying to remember which. I think I started off on a Miller to B. I'm just going to check something real quick here. So I'm not 100% sure here. I just remembered this because I deleted those 2 videos on Twitch. And I don't think I uploaded them to YouTube. Okay. So I think I'm good. I'm starting off after Strangers of Carvajal. So that puts me at okay, Red Strangers of Carvajal. So that puts me to Flight of Destiny. All right. Chapter 10. You're a great clickbait. Flight of Destiny. Eragon's mind churned as he sped on his way. He ran as fast as he could, refusing to stop, even when his breath came in great gasps. As he pounded down the cold road, he cast out his mind for Saphira, but she was too far away from him to contact. He thought about what to say to Garrow. There was no choice now. He would have to reveal Saphira. He arrived home, panting for air and heart pounding. Garrow stood by the barn with the horses. Eragon hesitated. Should I talk to him now? He won't believe me unless Saphira is here. I'd better find her first. He slipped around the farm and into the forest. Saphira, he shouted with his thoughts. I come, was a dim reply, though through her words he sensed her alarm. He waited impatiently, though it was not long before the sound of wings filled the air. She landed amid a gout of smoke. What happened? She queried. He touched her shoulder and closed his eyes. Calming his mind, he quickly told her what had occurred. He mentioned the strangers. Saphira recoiled. She reared and roared deafeningly, then whipped her tail over his head. He scrambled back in surprise, ducking as her tail hit the snowdrift. Bloodlust and fear emanated from her in great sickening waves. Fire, enemies, death, murderers. What's wrong? He put all of his strength into the words, but an iron wall surrounded her mind, shielding her thoughts. She let out another roar and gouged the earth with her claws, tearing the frozen ground. Stop it! Garrow will hear! Oaths betrayed, souls killed, eggs shattered, blood everywhere, murderers! Frantic, he blocked out Saphira's emotions and watched her tail. When it flicked past him, he dashed to the side and grabbed the spike on her back. Clutching it, he pulled himself into the small hollow at the base of her neck and held on tightly as she reared again. Enough, Saphira! He bellowed. Her stream of thoughts ceased abruptly. He ran a hand over her scales. Everything's going to be all right. She crouched, and her wings rushed upward. They hung there for an instant, then drove down as she flung herself into the sky. Eragon yelled as the ground dropped away, and they rose above the trees. Turbulence buffeted him, snatching the breath out of his mouth. Saphira ignored his terror and banked towards the spine. Underneath, he glimpsed a farm and the Enora River. His stomach convulsed. He tightened his arms around Saphira's neck and concentrated on the scales in front of his nose, trying not to vomit as she continued to climb. When she leveled off, he gained the courage to glance around. The air was so cold that frost accumulated on his eyelashes. They had reached the mountains faster than he thought possible. For the air, the peaks looked like giant razor-sharp teeth waiting to slash them to ribbons. Saphira wobbled unexpectedly, and Eragon heaved over her side. He wiped his lips, tasting bile, and buried his head against her neck. "We have to go back," he pleaded. "The strangers are coming to the farm. Garrow has to be warned. Turn around." There was no answer. He reached for her mind, but was blocked by a barrier of roiling fear and anger. Determined to make her turn around, he grimly wormed into her mental armor. He pushed at its weak places, undermined the stronger sections, and fought to make her listen, but to no avail. Soon, mountains surrounded them, forming tremendous white walls broken by granite cliffs. The glaciers sat between the summits like frozen rivers. Long valleys and ravines opened beneath them. He heard the dismayed screech of birds far below as Saphira soared into view. He saw a herd of woolly goats bounding from ledge to ledge on a rocky bluff. Eragon was battered by swirling gusts from Saphira's wings, and whenever she moved her neck, he was tossed from side to side. She seemed tireless. He was afraid she was going to fly through the night. Finally, as darkness fell, she tilted into a shallow dive. He looked ahead and saw that they were headed for a small clearing in the valley. Saphira spiraled down, leisurely drifting over the treetops. She pulled back as the ground neared, filled her wings with air, and landed on her rear legs. Her powerful muscles rippled as they absorbed the shock of the impact. She dropped to all fours and skipped a step to keep her balance. Eragon slid off without waiting for her to fold her wings. As he struck the ground, his knees buckled and his cheeks slammed against the snow. He gasped as excruciating pain seared through his legs, sending tears to his eyes. His muscles, cramped from clenching for so long, shook violently. He rolled onto his back, shivering, and stretched his limbs as best he could. Then he forced himself to look down. 2 large blots darkened his wool pants from the inside of his thighs. He touched the fabric. It was wet. Alarmed, he peeled off the pants and grimaced. The insides of his legs were raw and bloody. The skin was gone, rubbed off by Saphira's hard scales. He gingerly felt the abrasions and winced. Cold bit into him as he pulled the pants back on, and he cried out as they scraped against the sensitive wounds. He tried to stand, but his legs would not support him. The deepening night obscuring his surroundings. The shaded mountains were unfamiliar. "I'm in the spine. I don't know where. During the middle of winter, with a crazed dragon, unable to walk or find shelter. Night is falling. I have to get back to the farm tomorrow, and the only way to do that is fly, which I can't endure anymore." He took a deep breath. "Oh, I wish Saphira could breathe fire." He turned his head and saw her next to him, crouching low to the ground. He put a hand on her side and found it trembling. The barrier in her mind was gone. Without it, her fear scorched through him. They clamped down on it and slowly soothed her with gentle images. "Why do the strangers frighten you?" "Murderers," she hissed. "Garrow is in danger and you kidnap me on this ridiculous journey? Are you unable to protect me?" She growled deeply and snapped her jaws. "Ah, but if you think you can, why run? Death is a poison." He leaned on one elbow and stifled his frustration. "Saphira, look where we are. The sun is down, and your flight has stripped my legs as easily as I would scale a fish. Is this what you wanted?" "No." "Then why did you do it?" he demanded. Through his link with Saphira, he felt her regret for his pain, but not for her actions. She looked away and refused to answer. The icy temperature deadened Eragon's legs. Although it lessened the pain, he knew his condition was not good. He changed tack. I'm going to freeze unless you make me a shelter or hollow so I can stay warm. Even a pile of pine needles and branches would do. She seemed relieved that he had stopped interrogating her. There is no need. I will curl around you and cover you with my wings. The fire inside me will stay the cold. Eragon let his head thump back on the ground. Fine, but scrape the snow off the ground. It'll be more comfortable. In answer, Saphira raised a drift with her tail, clearing it with one powerful stroke. She swept over the site again to remove the last few inches of hardened snow. He eyed the exposed dirt with distaste. I can't walk over there. You'll have to help me to it. Her head, larger than his torso, swung over to him and came to rest by his side. He stared at her large, sapphire-colored eyes and wrapped his hands around one of her ivory spikes. She lifted her head and slowly dragged him to the bare spot. Gently, gently! Stars danced in his eyes as he slid over the rock. But he managed to hold on. After he let go, Saphira rolled on her side, exposing her warm belly. He huddled against the smooth scales of her underside. Her right wing extended over him and enclosed him in complete darkness, forming a living tent. Almost immediately, the air began to lose its frigidity. He pulled his arms inside his coat and tied the empty sleeves around his neck. For the first time, he noticed that hunger gnawed at his stomach, but it did not distract him from his main worry. Could he get back to the farm before the strangers did? And if not, what would happen? Even if I can force myself to ride Saphira again, it'll be at least mid-afternoon before we get back. The strangers could be long gone before then. He closed his eyes and felt a single tear slide down his face. What have I done? That's the end of chapter 10. And chapter 11 I could read. I think it's short. Chapter 11. The Doom of Innocence. When Eragon opened his eyes in the morning, he thought the sky had fallen. An unbroken plain of blue stretched over his head and slanted to the ground. Still half asleep, he reached out tentatively and felt a thin membrane under his fingers. It took him a long minute to realize what he was staring at. He bent his neck slightly and glared at the scaly haunch his head rested on. Slowly, he pushed his legs out from his fetal curl, scabs cracking. The pain had subsided some from yesterday, but he shrank from the thought of walking. Burning hunger reminded him of his missed meals. He summoned his energy to move and pounded weakly on Saphira's side. "Hey, wake up!" he yelled. She stirred and lifted her wing to admit a torrent of sunshine. He squinted as the snow momentarily blinded him. Beside him, Saphira stretched like a cat and yawned, flashing rows of white teeth. When Eragon's eyes adjusted, he examined where they were. Imposing and unfamiliar mountains surrounded them, casting deep shadows on the clearing. Off to one side, he saw a trail cut through the snow and into the forest, where he could hear the muffled gurgling of a creek. Groaning, he stood and swayed, then stiffly hobbled to a tree. He grabbed one of its branches and threw his weight against it. It held, then broke with a loud crack. He ripped off the twigs, fit one end of the branch under his arm, and planted the other firmly in the ground. With the help of his improved crutch, he limped to the iced-over creek. He broke through the hard shell and cupped the clear, bitter water. Sated, he returned to the clearing. As he emerged from the trees, he finally recognized the mountains and lay of the land. This was where, amid deafening sound, Saphira's egg had first appeared. He sagged against a rough trunk. There could be no mistake, for now he saw the gray trees that had been stripped of their needles in the explosion. How did Saphira know where this was? She was still an egg. My memories must have given her enough information to find it. He shook his head in silent astonishment. Saphira was waiting patiently for him. "Will you take me home?" he asked her. She cocked her head. "I know you don't want to, but you must. Both of us carry an obligation to Garrow. He has cared for me, and through me you. Would you ignore that debt? What will be said of us in years to come if we don't return? That we hid like cowards while my uncle was in danger? I can hear it now, the story of the rider and his craven dragon. And if there will be a fight, let's face it and not shy away. You're a dragon. Even a shade would run for you, yet you crouch in the mountains like a frightened rabbit. Eragon meant to anger her, and he had succeeded. A growl rippled in her throat as her head jabbed within inches of his face. She bared her fangs and glared at him, smoke trailing from her nostrils. He hoped that he had not gone too far. Her thoughts reached him, red with anger. Blood will meet blood. I will fight. Our words, our fate bind us, but try me not. I will take you because of debt owed. Into foolishness we fly. Foolishness or not, he said into the air, there is no choice. We must go. He ripped his shirt in half and stuffed a piece into each side of his pants. Gingerly, he hoisted himself onto Saphira and took a tight hold on her neck. This time, he told her to fly. Fly lower, fly faster. Time is of the essence. Don't let go, she cautioned, then surged into the sky. They rose above the forest and leveled out immediately, barely staying above the branches. Eragon's stomach lurched, and he was glad it was empty. Faster, faster, he urged. She said nothing, but the beat of her wings increased. He screwed his eyes shut and hunched his shoulders. He had hoped that the extra padding of his shirt would protect him, but every movement sent pangs through his legs. Soon, signs of hot blood trickled down his calves. Concern emanated from Saphira. She went even faster now, her wings straining. The land sped past, as if it were being pulled out from under them. Eragon imagined that someone on the ground they were just a blur. By early afternoon, Palancar Valley lay before them. Clouds obscured his vision to the south. Carvajal was to the north. Saphira glided down while Eragon searched for the farm. When he spotted it, fear jolted him. A black plume with orange flames dancing at his base rose from the farm. Saphira, he pointed, get me down there, now! She locked her wings and tilted into a steep dive, hurtling groundward at a frightening rate. Then she altered her dive slightly, so they sped towards the forest. He yelled over the screaming air, land in the fields! He held on tighter as they plummeted. Saphira waited until they were only a few feet off the ground before diving her wings downward in several powerful strokes. She landed heavily, breaking his grip. He crashed into the ground, then staggered upright, grasping for breath. The house had been blasted apart. Timbers and boards that had been walls and roof were strewn across a wide area. The wood was pulverized, as if a giant hammer had smashed it. Sooty shingles lay everywhere. A few twisted metal plates were all that remained of the stove. The snow was perforated with smashed white crockery and chunks of bricks from the chimney. Thick, oily smoke billowed from the barn, which burned fiercely. The farm animals were gone, either killed or frightened away. Uncle! Eragon ran to the wreckage, hunting through the deserted rooms for Garrow. There was no sign of him. Uncle! Eragon cried again. Saphira walked around the house and came to the side. Sorrow breeds here, she said. This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't run away with me. We would not be alive if we had stayed. Look at this, he screamed. We could have warned Garrow. It's your fault he didn't get away. He slammed his fist against a pole, splitting the skin on his knuckles. Blood dripped down his fingers as he stalked out of the house. He stumbled to the path that led to the road and bent down to examine the snow. Several tracks were before him, but his vision was blurry and he could barely see. Am I going blind? He wondered. With a shaking hand, he touched his cheeks and found them wet. A shadow fell on him as Saphira loomed overhead, sheltering him with her wings. Take comfort. All may not be lost. He looked up at her, searching for hope. Examine the trail. My eyes see only 2 sets of prints. Garrow could not have been taken far from here. He focused on the trampled snow. The faint imprints of 2 pairs of leather boots headed towards the house. On top of those were traces of the 2 same sets of boots leaving, and whoever had made the departing tracks had been carrying the same weight as when they arrived. You're right. Garrow has to be here. He leapt to his feet and hurried back to the house. I will search around the buildings and in the forest, said Saphira. Eragon scrambled into the remains of the kitchen and frantically started digging through the pile of rubble. Pieces of debris that could not have moved normally on their own now seemed to shift on their own accord. A cupboard, mostly intact, stymied him for a second. Then he heaved and sent it flying. As he pulled on a board, something rattled behind him. He spun around, ready for an attack. A hand extended from under a section of collapsed roof. It moved weakly, and he grasped it with a cry. "Uncle, can you hear me?" There was no response. Eragon tore at the pieces of wood, heedless of the splinters that pierced his hands. He quickly exposed an arm and a shoulder, but was barred by a heavy beam. He threw his shoulder at it and shoved with every fiber of his being, but it defied his efforts. "Saphira, I need you!" She came immediately. Wood cracked under his feet as she crawled over the ruined walls. Without a word, she nosed past him and set her side against the beam. Her claws sank into what was left of the floor. Her muscles strained. With a grating sound, the beam lifted, and Eragon rushed under it. Garrow lay on his stomach, his clothes mostly torn off. Eragon pulled him out of the rubble. As soon as they were clear, Saphira released the beam, leaving it to crash to the floor. Eragon dragged Garrow out of the destroyed house and eased him to the ground. Dismayed, he touched his uncle gently. His skin was gray, lifeless, and dry, as if a fever had burned off any sweat. His lip was split, and there was a long scrape on his cheekbone. But that was not the worst. Deep, ragged burns covered most of his body. They were chalky white and oozed clear liquid. A cloying, sickening smell hung over him, the odor of rotting fruit. His breath came in short jerks, one sounding like a death rattle. "Murderers," hissed Saphira. "Don't say that. He can still be saved. We have to get him to Gertrude." "I can't carry him to Carvajal, though." Saphira presented an image of Garrow hanging under her while she flew. "Can you lift us both?" "I must." Eragon dug through the rubble until he found a board and leather thongs. He had Saphira pierce a hole with a claw at each of the board's corners. Then she looped a piece of leather through each hole and tied him to her forelegs. After checking to make sure the knots were secured, he rolled Garrow onto the board and lashed him down. As she did, a scrap of black cloth fell from his uncle's hand. It matched the stranger's clothing. He angrily stuffed it in a pocket, mounted Saphira, and closed his eyes as his body settled into a steady throb of pain. "Now!" She leapt up, hind legs digging into the ground. Her wings clawed at the air as she slowly climbed. Tendons strained and popped as she battled gravity. For a long, painful second, nothing happened. But then she lunged forward powerfully, and they rose higher. Once they were over the forest, Eragon told her, "Follow the road. It'll give you enough room if you have to land." "I might be seen." "It doesn't matter anymore." She argued no further as she veered to the road and headed for Carvajal. Garrow swung wildly underneath them. Only the slender leather cords kept him from falling. The extra weight slowed Saphira, but long her head sagged, and there was froth at her mouth. She struggled to continue, yet they were almost a league from Carvajal when she locked her wings and sank towards the road. Her hind feet touched with a shower of snow. Eragon tumbled off her, landing heavily on his side to avoid hurting his legs. He struggled to his feet and worked to untie the leather from Saphira's legs. Her thick panting filled the air. "Find a safe place to rest," he said. "I don't know how long I'll be gone, so you'll have to take care of yourself for a while." "I will wait," she said. He gritted his teeth and began to drag Garrow down the road. The first few steps sent an explosion of agony through him. "I can't do this." He howled at the sky and took a few more steps. His mouth locked into a snarl. He stared at the ground between his feet as he forced himself to hold a steady pace. It was a fight against his unruly body, a fight he refused to lose. The minutes crawled by at an excruciating rate. Each yard he covered seemed many times that. With desperation, he wondered if Carvajal still existed, or the strangers had burnt it down too. After a time, through a haze of pain, he heard shouting and looked up. Brahm was running towards him, eyes large, hair awry, and one side of his head caked with dried blood. He waved his arms wildly before dropping his staff and grabbing Eragon's shoulders, saying something in a loud voice. Eragon blinked uncomprehendingly. Without warning, the ground rushed up to meet him. He tasted blood, then blacked out. And that ends chapter, what is it, 11? I don't know. I will continue the other ones at a later date.